أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وذرياته أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and welcome to the weekly circle organized by members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Today's speaker inshallah is Shiraz Maher, who will be looking at the subject matter of globalization. In his talk inshallah he will explain how we should understand this and what are the implications of globalization for Islam and the Muslims. Inshallah, hand over to the speaker.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على إمام الهدى والمتقين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن اتبعهم إلى يوم الدين. يقول رب العزة والجلال في قرآن الكريم بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا يحسبن الذين يبخلون بما آتاهم الله من فضله هو خير لهم بل هو شر لهم سيطوقون ما بخلوا به يوم القيامة ولله ميراث السماوات والأرض والله بما تعملون خبير. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, in translation of the verse, "And let not those who hoard up that which Allah has bestowed upon them of His bounty, of wealth, think that it is better for them. No, it will be worse for them. That which they hoard will be on their collar on the day of resurrection. Allah's is the heritage of the heavens and the earth, and Allah is well acquainted with all that you do." My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. The world in which we live is changing. Since the destruction of the Khilafah and then the subsequent collapse of communism, the world has experienced profound social, economic, political and cultural, technological and financial changes. The name attributed by some commentators to this new epoch is globalization. And if you were to stop 10 people outside on the street and ask them what they understood by this term, then you'd get 10 different answers. But Thomas Friedman, the famous political theorist, he perhaps came closest when he described it as an all-embracing phenomenon shaped by global capitalism. And he has a point. Free trade initiatives, laissez-faire economies, and relaxed trading tariffs have all been encouraged by the capitalist nations of the West. They would seem to be its main proponents and the main evangelists of this theory. And why not? Free trade certainly sounds reasonable enough. Much of the language used to describe it suggests that it's a positive trend. We're told that it removes barriers, restrictions, and obstacles to what should otherwise be free trade. Yet when we scrutinize the reality, we find that this message has brought joy to the few and misery to the many. So behind the mirage of this message, we should ask, for whom is it free? If we examine the US policy towards international relations after the First World War and throughout the interwar period, then we find a very clear and distinct difference between her attitude then and her attitude today. Following the Great War, the victors decided to form an international institution, a league, where countries could arbitrate and resolve disputes. In the end, the League of Nations was established, and in essence it operates much like the United Nations does today. What's interesting and what we're concerned with is not with how it operated, but is with America's attitude towards it. With the League's headquarters based in Paris and the International Finance Conference held in Brussels, these early institutions were dominated by the European powers who helped create them. Sensing only a limited opportunity to control them, the US administration quickly dismissed the internationalist system promoted by Europe and instead pursued isolationist policies. During the 1920s and 30s, she remained insular and refrained from accepting any global structure which the Europeans tried to enforce over her. However, following the Second World War, a new line of thinking prevailed in Washington. If America could be the first to create these new institutions, then she could clearly use them as a tool for her objectives abroad. Hence it was this line of thinking which paved the way for the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions and influenced the US policy towards an enlarged international system. With her European rivals losing global influence, the IMF and World Bank were conceived by America at the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. Each had a very defined and a very specific role. The IMF was charged with maintaining the stability of the global financial system, whilst the World Bank was to help rebuild the economies of a world shattered by war. Right from the start, the US administration put in place the measures which would allow her to maintain discreet but firm control over these institutions. The first thing they did was to make the US dollar the standard to which all other currencies were pegged. The presidency for the bank is effectively decided by America, who controls 17% of the vote, more than any other nation. The next in line is Japan, who controls just 6%. The US Treasury also owns a commanding 51% of the World Bank, and is the only country to have a right of veto over policy and constitutional affairs at the bank. In addition, the US Congress has to annually approve her lending policies before any funds can be released, giving them a unique opportunity to impose their own conditions first. And of course, unlike the League of Nations, the head office of the World Bank is not in Paris, nor even in Europe, but in Washington, just a few streets away from the White House, the Treasury, and Washington-based political think tanks. Far from being independent and autonomous bodies, the Bretton Woods institutions are important vehicles used to further Washington's agenda. In the world which emerged after the Second World War, the US was primarily concerned with the containment of the Soviet threat. However, with the collapse of communism, policymakers in Washington were once again keen to take full advantage of this. The extent of their agenda became clear when Anthony Lake, the National Security Advisor in 1991, said, "The successor to the doctrine of enlargement must be a strategy of enlargement. Enlargement of the world's free community of market democracies. During the Cold War, even children understood America's security mission. As they looked at those maps on their classroom walls, they knew we were trying to contain the creeping expansion of the big red blob. Today, we might visualize our security mission as promoting the enlargement of the blue areas of market democracies." Having used the Bretton Woods institutions to contain the growth of communism, what America now wanted to do was shift her emphasis towards promoting capitalist ideals, with free trade being its central tenet. To achieve this, she went on to create the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 1995. It now works in tandem with the IMF and the World Bank to promote free trade initiatives across the world. Much like the Bretton Woods institutions, America ensured that she would be able to dominate the WTO's behavior by ensuring that policy-related decisions taken by the group would be reached through consensus and not through voting. What this essentially amounts to, and what this means in practice, is that the powerful economic trading blocs of North America and Europe band together and negotiate policies which they then enforce on others. Following their meeting in November 2001 in Qatar, the Indian ambassador described the WTO and condemned it as a hierarchical power-based system where the strong bully and control the weak. So it's important then that we consider how these institutions are used by the West to exploit the developing nations. By enticing a number of them into embracing free trade initiatives, the West is quick to offer them so-called economic reform packages, often in the form of a loan. What these loans amount to is the enslavement of entire populations, often for generations, and stifles the prospect for any independent future development. In order to be eligible for a loan, the recipient government is first required to carry out programs of drastic economic reform, drawn up for them by the IMF. These are best known as structural adjustment programs, or more commonly, SAPs. By restructuring their economies in line with SAP requirements, many developing nations have to shift their economic emphasis away from government expenditure and towards maximizing foreign earnings. This involves a threefold process. First, the economy becomes export-orientated with free markets for foreign imports. Secondly, the privatization of state industries takes place, often leading to mass unemployment. And thirdly, these countries experience cuts in public services such as healthcare and education, and an end to subsidies for food and fuel. After the damage caused by SAPs was finally exposed, the IMF repackaged it as a poverty reduction strategy. Although its basic ingredients remain the same, it continues to be imposed on developing nations. The continued use of such policies then greatly facilitates a powerful debt. At the turn of the last millennium, a number of countries, most notably Britain, pledged themselves to writing off third world debt. Such a generous gesture of goodwill, it seemed too good to be true, and it was. What we should note is that over 2/3 of third world debt is owed, not to governments, but to the World Bank and the IMF. And these institutions, they've already stated that there's no way they'll write off the national debt. But what they're willing to do, and what they've said they will do, is arrange for a debt reschedulement. But again, there's a catch. They'll only offer this debt relief to those nations which agree to first restructure their economies in line with the new global order. In turn, all this does then is create further debt and further problems for the developing nations, whilst interest continues to accumulate on the original loan. And so what we find is that it's a vicious cycle, one from which the developing nations cannot leave. What this strategy says to the developing countries, and what makes it so successful and so potent a tool, is that effectively you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. As it stands then, debt has therefore become an important weaponry in the armory of the developing nations and those who push for greater globalization. And at this point, it's worth bearing in mind the disastrous consequences produced by this process. In this era of supposed financial enlightenment, the era that has seen the alleged triumph of liberal democracy, almost half of the world's 6 billion people live on less than $2 a day. And of that, 1.2 billion live on less than $1 a day. In the last 40 years, the gap between the world's richest 20% of the people and the world's poorest 20% has doubled. And would you believe that the assets of the world's 3 richest billionaires exceeds the gross national product of the 48 least developing nations and their 600 million inhabitants? I just want you to think about that. That the 3 richest people in the world, they control more wealth than the poorest 600 million. But even then, some have hailed globalization as a great thing, arguing that it brings jobs and investment to new places throughout the world, arguing that those who live on $1 a day, well, it's $1 more than they would have had without globalization. But when we scratch the surface, what you find is that this heavy reliance on global markets by developing nations causes a great deal of insecurity and leaves many of their economies exposed and vulnerable. This was most dramatically seen during the East Asian crisis of 1997 to 98, when the bubble finally burst on the so-called tiger economies. As a result of extensive liberalization of the financial sector across the region, foreign capital poured into newly industrialized countries of East and Southeast Asia during the 1990s. It peaked at a net inflow of $93 billion in 1996. However, as soon as turmoil began to hit these markets, at the first hint of trouble, much of the foreign capital departed almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving a massive disaster in its wake. The crisis hit Indonesia the hardest, which saw $40 billion of foreign capital sucked out of its economy in just 6 months, between November 1997 and April 1998. During this period, real wages fell by 60% across the country, and in Indonesia's largest industrial city, the daily minimum wage collapsed from just $2 to just 30 cents. Observers have estimated that 40 million people in Indonesia, a fifth of her entire population, fell into poverty almost overnight. The economy, which shrank dramatically by 13% in 1998, is still feeling the effects of this collapse today. Her foreign minister, Mr. Ali Atlas, he summed up the situation before the UN General Assembly, saying, even the more dynamic developing countries, those that have managed to integrate themselves with the global economy through judicious macroeconomic policies and painstaking structural adjustments, have seen the development gains they earned over the past decades crumble in the span of a few weeks. The fact that the Asian crisis has been particularly harsh on those economies that have been liberalizing financial flows and investment for a good number of years, should therefore teach a valuable lesson to all of us in the developing world. This happened because much of the foreign capital is invested by large multinationals who have little concern then for the host nation. And it's clear that these corporations are the real driving force behind globalization. Observers agree that no one has benefited from it as much as them. More often than not, they're in a larger position than the host nations, putting them in a powerful place to dictate terms. Again, if we consider the theory, then it sounds great. Investment by a foreign company can provide jobs, stimulate growth, and offer developing countries access to new technology and skills. Yet in practice, multinationals simply exploit the cheap labor and offer and natural resources which the poor countries have, and leave them with nothing in return. To counter this, some governments have placed performance requirements for multinationals in order to ensure that their presence is of benefit to the host community. A notable example was China. If we consider a hotel chain, then any hotel chain wishing to set up business in China had to do so in partnership with a Chinese enterprise. Most of the staff employed at the hotel had to be Chinese, and the resources needed to run the hotel had to be bought from local producers, such as fruit and veg, and this ensured local people benefited from the new jobs on offer. Also, because the hotel is jointly owned, then its profits are shared between the foreign and the Chinese sides, and in this way China managed to use foreign investment to its advantage. By contrast, many hotels in the Caribbean are 100% owned by foreign firms. Usually the only jobs available for them, for local people, are as poorly paid cleaners or other low-level staff, since most of the managers come from Europe or the USA. Much of the produce on sale will have been imported, leaving few opportunities for local firms to develop as suppliers. In fact, many have been driven out of business, and it's estimated that up to 80% of profits from tourism are whisked out of the Caribbean altogether. It would seem then that the policy pursued by the Chinese government is a good one. However, it upset the multinationals by denting their high profit margins. Hence, performance requirements on foreign companies are increasingly being outlawed. Indeed, as part of its bid for membership to the WTO, China had to amend its national legislation to drop many of the requirements it used to place on foreign firms. Officially, China was told that its practice is deemed to curb economic freedom, stifle competition, and place barriers before trade. Yet the new legislation merely allows multinationals to make greater profits and prevents local communities from enjoying the benefits of investment. Another style used by the West to subordinate developing nations lies in the theory of privatization. In 1997, the text of a secret agreement on investment was leaked and made public. Behind closed doors, the Western states had been negotiating a multilateral agreement on investment, the MAI, which would give multinational corporations unprecedented powers over governments and local communities across the world. Under the MAI, there would be no stopping multinationals from taking over any domestic industry of their choice. Performance requirements on foreign companies would also be outlawed. Although the MAI negotiations collapsed in late 1998, these multinational corporations have continued to explore new ways of opening up and controlling lucrative markets which were previously closed to them. The most potent weapon they have found in this front is privatization. In many of the world's poorest countries, privatization of essential public services has already taken place as a result of structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. The effects of this privatization program have been disastrous, as the World Bank admits itself. The introduction of school fees, where there was previously free education, has driven many poor families to withdraw their children from school, whilst medical costs have put basic healthcare beyond the reach of millions. Although they acknowledge the harm which privatization has brought to poor communities in the third world, the IMF and the World Bank still insists on prescribing it as an economic model. Water privatization is just one example that we can consider. The World Bank notes that water in Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, costs the sector as it does from the public supply, And in Mauritania, poor families now have to spend up to a fifth of their household income on water alone. Yet both the World Bank and the IMF continue to enforce water privatization on developing countries. During 2000 alone, the IMF made water privatization or full cost recovery a condition of loan agreements to 12 African countries. The World Bank has promised Ghana an extra $100 million in loans if it privatizes its water supply. Another area which threatens the developing world is the privatization of knowledge. And here we find a very sinister case of duplicity, double standards and hypocrisy. Whilst promoting liberalization of markets and resources in the developing world, the WTO extends no such policy to the Western nations and instead vehemently guards their right to protect intellectual property rights. It took measures to protect them by introducing a controversial agreement known as TRIPS, or trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. Effectively then, this has closed down the access developing countries would have had to new technology and medical advances in the West, which could greatly benefit its people. Countries such as India, Brazil and Thailand have all developed their own pharmaceutical industries over the course of many years, producing generic medicines at a fraction of the cost of brand name drugs made by the multinationals. Consider the drug fluconazole, which is used to treat HIV-related meningitis. It costs around $50 for 100 tablets in India, whilst the brand name equivalent costs $700 in Indonesia and $800 in the Philippines, prices far beyond the reach of most people in those countries. Yet the WTO aims to restrict the right of developing countries to produce cheaper drugs for their own people, forcing them instead to accept private ownership of brand name medicine through patents. In 1998, the WTO ruled that the Indian government must amend its national legislation in line with the TRIPS agreement to give greater rights to pharmaceutical companies and their patents. In March 2001, a group of 39 drugs companies launched a court case under the TRIPS agreement against the South African government's Medicines Act. Nelson Mandela introduced it in 1997 in order to allow South Africa to obtain the cheapest medicines possible to fight illnesses like AIDS, tuberculosis and other infectious diseases. The act required pharmacists to prescribe a cheaper generic version of brand name drugs whenever possible, and empowered the South African health minister to override pharmaceutical patents when public health was at stake. When you consider that 4 million of its population, 4 million of its people are proven to be HIV positive, then the South African government argued that the Medicine Act is essential to the protection of its public health. Yet the drugs companies insist, and the WTO insists, that South Africa must first fulfill its rights and its responsibilities as a WTO member. And so with corporate profits at stake, it seems that the West would value patents over patients. It becomes clear then how the financial institutions created through the last century by America have been used to strengthen her global hegemony. In the process, she has enslaved entire nations with crippling loans and has reduced them to being little more than silent states by removing all barriers to trade. The removal of these barriers has greatly eroded national sovereignty and has left the economies of many developing nations as vulnerable and exposed. By restructuring entire economies, the West has ensured that she receives the goods and resources she needs, with little consideration given to the needs of the host nation. And with staggering hypocrisy, whilst the West has forced developing nations to pull down their barriers to trade, it is the West who has been busy constructing its own barriers. Last year, the US raised steel tariffs by up to 30% to protect its own domestic markets, repeating what it had done in 1997. She also goes against the very free market ideals which she so richly espouses on the international arena by subsidizing her farmers. In this, she is second only to Europe, who has a centrally coordinated strategy through the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. And she vehemently protects the interests of her own powerful multinationals through intellectual property agreements, denying developing nations from sharing and from benefiting in her own knowledge. It is clear then that the West has no interest in developing other economies. Instead, what she needs is cheap labor and raw materials to produce goods for her mass market and high profit margins for her corporate fat cats. Although the most striking feature of globalization is its financial dimension, it is not restricted to this alone. The West has taken a coordinated approach towards asserting her global hegemony through the globalization process. By promoting the concept of the world being a global village, we have seen the emergence of new culture through new media technologies such as satellite TV and the internet. In turn, this has led to global cultural symbols becoming established, such as Coca-Cola, Nike and McDonald's. Much of the political culture of the West has unfortunately now creeped into Muslim lands. And let's see what this means in practice. Last year was the first year that Pakistan officially recognized Valentine's Day. Many young lovers were actively encouraged to follow their hearts and engage in promiscuous activity by asking out the ones they loved. Musharraf's government was also keen to enlarge the annual Basant, the kite flying festival in Lahore, making it into the Pakistani equivalent of the Notting Hill Carnival, with music, dancing and free mixing between the sexes. In Egypt, Mubarak's regime recognized Christmas this year, making it a national holiday for the first time in the country's history. The West has also exploited satellite communications to promote its culture and lethal cocktails of freedoms through channels like MTV Asia and America Plus. And what we find is that the West has utilized these technologies to carry its call directly into the Muslim lands and has found our rulers only too willing to help as they attempt to corrode our pristine Islamic culture. It would seem that America supports all forms of globalization, but on one condition, that she remains firmly in the driving seat. This is, of course, natural. She is keen to export American values, to increase her own hegemony, and to extend her balance of power. This is best done behind the smokescreen and the mirage of globalization, which cloaks her true intentions behind seemingly independent economic and cultural institutions. My dear brothers and sisters, Islam considers the economic problem in a radically different way from the current thinking of today. In the West, they understood the economic problem as offsetting an unlimited number of wants against unlimited number of resources. Hence, to bridge this gap, to overcome this disparity, the sole emphasis of the economy is focused on increasing production. Production is then the key for Western economists, and this is why they give so much credence to economic indicators like the GDP and the GNP. However, Islam viewed the economic problem fundamentally as being a human problem and placed the emphasis not on increased production but on the effective distribution of wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden the circulation of wealth solely amongst the wealthy, something which characterizes the Western system, where not only does it circulate amongst a select few, but the wealth is allowed to generate more wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْعَيْنِيَاهِ مِنْكُمْ. He says in translation of the verse, lest it circulate solely amongst the wealthy from amongst you. Practically, what does this mean? We can see an example in the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam after he had peacefully conquered Bani Nadir and then expelled the Jews from there. What he sallallahu alaihi wasallam noticed was a disparity growing in wealth between the Ansar and the Muhajirin. So what he sallallahu alaihi wasallam did was to divide the booty solely amongst the Muhajirin and not amongst the Ansar, with the exception of two. The exception was for Abu Dajana and Ibn Hanif, who were both poor at the time, just like the Muhajirin. Ibn Abbas radiyallahu an reported that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to the Ansar, if you wish, I could ask you to share your homes and your wealth with the Muhajirin and divide among you this booty. Or if you wish, and I shall not have to give to you anything from this booty. Upon hearing this, The Ansar replied, "We would rather share our homes and our wealth with our brothers and let them have the booty as well." There's another point that we should consider here. That the booty of Bani Nadir, it belonged to the Bayt al-Mal and hence all of the Muslim Ummah. However, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam utilized it to make the distribution solely amongst the poor in order to address the growing disparity within the society and to address the basic needs of the poor. Compare this, my dear brothers and sisters, with the situation today, where, like we have seen, 3 of the richest people in the world control more wealth than 600 million, and it is a gulf which continues to grow. Also, as we have seen, free trade is essentially a myth. There is nothing free about it. On the contrary, it often ends up costing the developing nations a great deal in both financial and human terms. And the only people that it benefits, the Western states, are the ones who don't believe in free trade, because they're the ones who raise their own barriers to trade. And if we examine the majority of global trade movements, then it becomes clear that it tends to be exclusively amongst the powerful trading blocs of NAFTA, the North Atlantic Treaty, the EU and Japan. The developing nations are largely excluded from this. For them, free trade initiatives merely undermine their political sovereignty whilst holding their economies at ransom. In essence, all they have become is enslaved labourers working for the benefit of their Western corporate masters. Because of this, and the way in which free trade is inextricably tied to the ideological objectives of the West, free trade is categorically prohibited in Islam and would be rejected by the future Khilafah state. Islam defined foreign trade as one of the relations between the state and other states, people and nations. These dealings are therefore managed by the state, and it is the state who is charged with coordinating and administering such affairs. So the Khalif has the right to decide to trade with some people and not to trade with others. He can choose to cut some off and not to cut others off. Only by taking charge of her affairs like this, then, will the Khilafah be able to maintain economic independence. Whilst if she accepted the free trade initiatives of the West, then her economy would become overrun by the Western powers. A matter which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made haram when He said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَا يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ سَبِيلًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and Allah will never allow, He will never allow for the kafireen to have authority over the believers. Hence the Islamic system demands that the state be independent. And the only way to ensure this is through transforming the economy into one which is production based. But even then, despite this, some people will say that you people, you Islamists, that you're dreaming, that this can't be a reality. Globalization, it's an all-encompassing, an all-embracing, and most importantly, an inevitable phenomenon. So we're naive and we're misguided for just thinking idealistically that the Khilafah, it's just going to come along and it's going to break out of the current international superstructure. My dear brothers and sisters, this highly erroneous understanding is dangerous because it's blatantly incorrect for 2 very simple reasons. The first is that it's already been done. Dr. Mahathir of Malaysia, he directly intervened during the Asian crisis to prevent the outflow of capital from his country, thereby preventing the destabilization of his economy. He subsequently reintroduced the gold standard and has countered the actions of currency speculators by raising his own barriers. He's prevented foreign capital from leaving the country for at least a year. Far from burying his economy, many economists, many of them in the West, have recognized that this is one reason which may indeed account for the sustained growth of the Malaysian economy over the last decade. The second reason why the Khilafah would be able to break out of the current system is that the West would have to trade with her, and she would have to trade with her on her terms, because the Khilafah is the one that would possess all the resources. As it stands in the current situation, the West is able to utilize the raw materials in the Muslim lands by exploiting cheap labor to mine these resources, to develop it, and then export it for consumption in the mass markets of the West. These mass markets of the West are dependent on the resources and the goods which are produced in the Muslim lands. These countries then are currently guided by weak political leadership who feel compelled because they've signed up to phony free trade agreements. So there are two problems that these economies in the Muslim lands face. The first is that they don't produce what they need, they produce what they can sell. And secondly, the capital revenue generated by the sale of their cash crops seeps back out of the country when multinationals repatriate much of their profit. The Khilafah would be dramatically different in her handling of all of this. First and foremost, she would be a strong and ideological nation, free from the shackles of the West. She would undertake a program of rapid industrialization to build a strong economic infrastructure and would pay no credence to the Western intellectual property rights or to restrictions put on medicines such as the TRIPS agreement does. Rather, she would utilize the resources of the Ummah for the benefit of the Ummah and would negotiate with the West strictly on our terms and not on theirs. As it stands then, my dear brothers and sisters, the world will continue to suffocate at the hands of capitalism. This wretched ideology has caused misery for the many and joy for the few. The Western powers have been extremely clever in their use of seemingly independent bodies to pursue their own unilateral aims. Whilst the Muslim lands continue to be subjugated to the West, under the yoke of corrupt and inept rulers, there is little prospect that this Ummah will ever return to her former glory. Yet it is fard upon us that we work for Islam, that we carry the Islamic dawah, and that we do the righteous deeds so as to hasten our return to Islam as a complete system which will soon be implemented over a state, inshaAllah. The Muslims have suffered for long enough then under the secular rulers and have been duped into accepting the Western systems in place of the Islamic one. They have suffered wretched international alliances, humiliation, disgrace and poverty. Only the Khilafah will stand boldly as an independent nation on the international arena, and only her presence will see America's current hegemony undermined. Only this state, guided by the sincere Islamic leadership, will then regain the honor, dignity and unity of this ummah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَقُلْ اِعْمَلُوا فَسَيَرَى اللَّهُ أَعْمَالَكُمْ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ أَقُولُ قَوْلِي هَذَا وَاسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ.
Jazakallah khair, Shiraz. Now, as usual, we'll open the floor for any questions or comments that you might have regarding the subject matter of globalization as it is today. Zahid.
You mentioned your talk about the West use debt as an economic tool or instrument. Can you just elaborate upon your point, please?
Okay, the question is that the West, they use debt as a tool in the pursuit of globalization. Can you just further elaborate upon this?
What you find with debt is that when the Western nations imposed these rates of interest on the loans that they gave, they knew full well that the loan and the rate of interest on it is so high that these nations will never be able to pay it back in full. And what you also find is that these nations have paid back that debt several times over. So if we take the example of Pakistan, for every dollar she borrowed, she's paid back 12, but she still owes another 16. So there's a case to say, well look, why don't you just write off this debt? Because not only have these nations paid it back now, on the principal sum, but they've paid back several times over. But we find that the West is very unwilling and very reluctant to do this. Why? The basic answer is because it's their objective to create a culture of dependency. As long as a country is heavily indebted to the West, it'll never be able to stand up on its own 2 feet. It will forever be dependent on them. And hence, by maintaining these huge levels of debt and interest over the African nations, then we see what effects it has on them. A famous economist put this and called it the codependency theory. And he said that this is effectively what the West is out to do. What you have to bear in mind is that the economies here in the West is that they're service-based. They don't produce goods, but they produce services. So they still need to receive these goods for consumption in their markets. The only way to do this is to keep a firm stranglehold over the developing nations, so as to utilize their cheap labor and their natural resources so that they can produce these products for consumption here in the West at a fraction of the cost it would cost them to produce here. So by keeping them subservient, this is what the West wants to do, and it wants to dictate its terms in that way. So this is why debt has become a very potent weapon for it in that respect.
What is the Bush administration's current policy on globalization?
Okay, the question is, what is the Bush administration's policy towards globalization?
Okay. What we find is that the objectives have essentially remained the same. And these objectives essentially are to further US interests abroad, to extend America's sphere of influence throughout the world, and to maintain her military superiority. And this really ties in very closely with her foreign policy objectives. But there's a slight difference, as you can see, between the Bush administration and the previous Clinton administration. But we should be clear in our understanding that this doesn't lie in the objectives, but rather in the styles and the means. I think it's become very clear that the neocons in America, they favor far more US militarism and a far more aggressive stance on the international arena. It's what you might call gunboat diplomacy. So Thomas Friedman, I mentioned him at the start. He said that the hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's can't flourish without McDonnell Douglas. He's the person who designed the F-16. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for Silicon Valley's technology to flourish is called the US Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps. Thomas Friedman is a leading neocon. So you can say that the Bush administration, her objective is the same and her policy is the same. But it's one of continuity, although the styles and means have changed somewhat from the last government, insofar as they pursue these objectives now with far more aggressiveness on the international arena.
Okay, if you look to the Muslim countries, we find many of them in huge debts. You find Pakistan $40 billion debt. Even Saudi Arabia owes up to $30 billion in debt. And it just goes on and on with all of the Muslim countries. Now when the Khilafah returns, what would it do about these debts?
Okay, the question is that many of the Muslim countries currently they have a lot of debt. Give the example of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. So how do you foresee the Khilafah and how it would tackle this problem of debt?
Okay. And it's a very common question as to what we would do, because we find all the Muslim countries are very, very heavily indebted to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So what would happen here in relation to these debts when the Khilafah is re-established? The issue here is that largely the Khalif would first and foremost study the nature of these contracts that exist between the Muslim nations and these creditors. He would determine whether the contract is batil, fasid, or indeed if it's a legitimate contract. And based on that now, let's consider the reality. If, for example, the state had borrowed £100 and had only paid back 80, so there was 20, this is not including in any interest, this is still the principal amount, then based on his understanding of the contract, the Khalif may choose and has the right to pay that difference on the principal amount. After this though, he wouldn't pay any interest on it. On the other hand, the Khalif may decide, even if there was a shortfall, that the Western nations have already taken their dues in resources and exploitation, and he may choose not to honor it whatsoever. Again, this would be at his discretion, based on his understanding of that initial contract. But if we look at the reality, like you mentioned, and like we touched upon in the talk, is that the Muslim nations have taken these debts, and they've paid them now several times over, and this is the reality, not the scenario I described earlier. In this instance, the question effectively that you're asking is that, would the Khalif pay interest? To which the answer is very simply, no way.
In your talk, you mentioned about the cultural, the cultural attack how do you see the Khilafah countering this cultural globalization?
So the question is, in your talk in Circle, it was mentioned regarding the cultural aspect of globalization. So how would the Khilafah tackle this?
Okay. I mean, when you look at how we might counter globalization, and specifically the effects of cultural imperialism on the Muslim lands, then you can see how the West does this herself, how she protects herself against things which are deemed to be against her interests. For example, there was the Spycatcher book was banned here in Britain by Thatcher's government because it was deemed to be counterproductive to the national interest. Even recently, just last month, I was reading that the New York Stock Exchange has barred reports from Al Jazeera from reporting inside from the trading pit in retribution, essentially, for what they saw as Al Jazeera's biased reporting of the war in Iraq. So again, you find that they've barred these reporters from entering and from reporting the news because they deem it to be not conducive to the national interest. In the same way, the Khilafah would look very closely at the kind of medias the West might utilize to try and propagate her ideology within the state. And quite clearly, in the way that they prohibit certain media sources and certain books and magazines, so on, we would take the same measure and simply prohibit them from being aired into the state. In addition, we'd utilize these technologies to turn it back on them and propagate Islam to the West, set up debates, exposing the fallacy of the Western civilization and showing Islam to be an alternative. And likewise, within the state, we'd culture the people in the Islamic culture and Islamic thoughts via these medias.
Could you please highlight some of the difference between how capitalism views poverty and how Islam views poverty?
The question is, can you highlight the differences in terms of how capitalism views poverty and how Islam views poverty?
Okay. Again, something we touched on briefly in the circle. Now, when you look at the capitalist understanding and how it understood this, it saw poverty as being a national problem. And this is why when it attempts to tackle poverty or reduce poverty, it looks towards indicators like the GDP and the GNP. And this line of thinking is shaped by what's known as the trickle-down effect. That you put in the money into the economy and it will basically trickle down through all sectors of the community right down to the bottom. But if you look at the reality, after almost half a century of trying out this strategy, what you found is that this trickle down hasn't really happened. And if anything, really, there's been a trickle up and not a trickle down. Because the gap in the Western states between the rich and the poor is getting larger. Islam understood this as a human problem and focused on satisfying the basic needs of the individual concerned. So Rasulullah ﷺ said, "The son of Adam has no better right than food, clothing and shelter." And so here's the difference, really. The capitalists view the problem as lying with the state and lying with the resources and the scarcity of these resources, and not with the man himself. But the real emphasis, and what Islam made the emphasis, has to be on the basic human needs of man, and how best to distribute the wealth to members of the society to guarantee the satisfaction of those basic needs. And just to give you an idea as to how much of a priority the alleviating and reducing poverty in the state would be, is in the saying of Imam Ali radhiyallahu anhu, when he said, "If poverty was a man, then I'd kill him."
Inshallah, we'll just finish off with the circles there. If there's any other further questions, then we can resume them, inshallah, after the circle with the rest of the brothers. They'll be here to answer your questions. I'll also ask Brother Shiraz to finish off with dua, inshallah.
حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم اللهم اتحد بلاد المسلمين وقلوبنا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر